The blue electric truck was plugged into my shed, not by mistake, not by accident. It was sucking electricity from my house like a giant metal leech. I stood frozen in the backyard, still holding a leaf rake, staring at the orange extension cord crawling across the grass like a lazy snake. It slid over the wooden fence, slipped through my neighbor's lavender bushes, and disappeared into the outlet on the wall of my shed. The Rivian R1T sat there with its nose pointed straight into the shed, like an animal lowering its head to drink. The charging light blinked softly. The electric meter on the side of my house was spinning so fast, I could almost hear the metal whining. In 40 years of working as an electrician, I had seen plenty of strange things. But this was the first time I had walked into my yard and found my neighbor's vehicle charging from my outlet as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My name is Daniel Brooks, 62 years old. I live in Mesa Verde Estates, a quiet neighborhood in Arizona where everything is governed by HOA rules. The grass has to be trimmed to the right height. Trash cans must be put out on the correct day. And according to the logic of the woman who lives on the other side of the fence, my electrical outlet apparently counts as community property. That woman is named Linda Caldwell. If you have ever read HOA stories online, the kind of Reddit story where people talk about Karens who try to control an entire neighborhood, Linda is almost the perfect example. She does not think she is the villain. In her mind, she is the guardian of order, the protector of standards, the person who makes sure everyone follows the rules. But in reality, Linda is the headache of the entire block. She once sent a fine to an old man because his American flag was the wrong size. She once called the police because kids were playing basketball after 9 in the evening. And in every HOA meeting, she sits in the front row, speaking as if she is running a small country instead of a neighborhood with a few dozen houses. I looked at the extension cord, then at the Rivian. Tire marks were clearly pressed into my grass. This was not the first time. The flattened patches showed that the truck had been parked there for several nights. So Linda had not just tried it once. She had been doing this for weeks. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. In all the Karen stories I had heard during neighborhood barbecues, no one had ever told a story about a neighbor plugging an electric vehicle into someone else's shed. I walked into the shed. The outlet was still warm. Her cord was jammed tightly into the power strip I usually use for my saw and drill. The breaker hummed slightly. I could almost feel the current stretching through the wires like a pulled guitar string. I knew exactly how much electricity that truck was pulling. And I knew something else. If Linda thought I was just an old man living alone who did not understand electricity, then she had seriously misjudged me. But at that moment, I did nothing. I simply unplugged the cord, coiled it up neatly, and placed it on the grass right next to the fence by her yard. About 2 hours later, I saw Linda in her front yard. She was trimming roses. Oversized sunglasses covered half her face. Her movements were slow and confident, as if the entire neighborhood were her personal garden. I stepped across the low fence between our yards. Linda looked up when she saw me. The polite HOA smile appeared instantly. "Hello, Daniel." I pointed toward the backyard. "You're Rivian." She tilted her head slightly, as if she did not understand. I just unplugged the charging cable from my shed. There was a moment of silence. Then Linda shrugged lightly and clipped another rose. "Oh, that." She said it the way someone comments on the weather. "I noticed you were not using that outlet at night anyway." I blinked. "You're charging your truck using my electricity." Linda sighed, the kind of sigh people make when they think someone else is being dramatic. "Daniel, don't be so dramatic. It's just a few kilowatts." I stared at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the trees, leaves rustling softly. Somewhere in the distance, someone's lawnmower hummed. Linda continued trimming her roses as if the conversation was already over. In her mind, I was probably just the grumpy old neighbor. But Linda did not know one thing. 40 years before she ever started sending her first HOA violation letters, I had spent my entire career working with electricity. Factories, industrial systems, power grids complicated enough that a single mistake could black out an entire district. And as I looked at that orange cord crawling across my yard, a slow idea began forming in my mind. If Linda wanted to use my electricity that badly, then maybe I should let her use it. just not in the way she expected. That night, Linda's Rivian quietly slid back into my yard. I saw it through the kitchen window. The front of the truck crept slowly across the grass like a predator that already knew the path. The orange extension cord appeared again, dragged over the fence, slipping through the bushes, then disappearing into my shed. Linda thought I didn't know. Or worse, she thought I wouldn't dare do anything. I stood in the dark, holding a mug of cold coffee, watching the scene like a play where only I knew how the story would end. Linda stepped out of the truck and glanced around quickly. The streetlight cast a pale yellow glow across her face. There was no hesitation in her eyes. No fear. No embarrassment. Only the confidence of someone who believed she could not be touched. She plugged the cord into my outlet. The charger light began blinking. Then Linda turned around, shut the truck door, and walked back to her house as if she had just finished something completely legal. I let out a quiet breath. Over the years living in this HOA neighborhood, I had seen many types of Karens. People who tried to control the color of their neighbor's fence. People who measured the height of someone else's grass with a ruler. People who sent complaint emails at 3 in the morning. But Linda was on another level. She didn't believe she was wrong. In her mind, everything she did made perfect sense. And that was the most dangerous kind of person. I left the window and stepped into the backyard, quietly, without turning on the lights. The shed sat still under the moonlight. The extension cord stretched tightly from the outlet like a vein carrying blood. I bent down and placed my hand on the electrical box mounted on the wall. Warm. The current was running strong. I could almost feel the energy being pulled away, little by little, ampere by ampere. Inside my head, numbers began to appear automatically. Voltage, load current, lithium battery charging cycles. 40 years as an electrician is not something you forget. I walked into the shed and sat down on the old wooden chair beside the workbench. The tools hanging on the wall clinked softly when I brushed against them. There was one thing Linda did not understand about electricity. An electric vehicle does not simply plug in and absorb energy. Every charging system depends on stable current. Change the structure of that current just a little, and the entire process can reverse. I sat there for a long moment. The night wind slipped through the crack in the door. Outside in the yard, the Rivian rested silently, its charging light blinking in a steady rhythm. Inside my mind, an idea slowly began to take shape. Not sabotage, not cutting the cable, not calling the police, or filing a complaint with the HOA. Those things would only allow Linda to turn herself into the victim. And Karens like Linda thrive on becoming the victim. No, I needed something more subtle, something that would make her walk straight into her own trap. I stood up and opened the breaker box inside the shed. The switches were lined up neatly. A small light reflected off the metal. I smiled. If Linda wanted to charge her truck here every night, I could absolutely let her. The only difference was that the electricity would not flow in the direction she expected. I spent nearly an hour in the shed. No rushing, no panic. The familiar movements returned like muscle memory. Opening the panel, adjusting the wires. Up, Tom, redirecting the current. Installing a small bypass that only someone who had worked with industrial power systems would think of. When I closed the breaker box again, everything looked completely normal. The outlet was still there. The cable could still plug in. The charging light would still glow. But the energy would not flow into the Rivian's battery. It would flow the other way. Not fast, not noisy, not enough to cause damage. Just enough so that every morning the truck would wake up with less energy than it had the night before. I stepped out of the shed and looked at the vehicle. It stood there, proud and silent. I could almost imagine Linda's face tomorrow morning. She would walk out to the yard with coffee in her hand, confident as always. She would open the truck door, look at the dashboard, and realize the battery had not increased. It had dropped. I went back inside, turned off the kitchen light, and headed upstairs. Before going to sleep, I looked out the window one more time. The Rivian was still plugged into my shed like a parasite clinging to its host. Linda believed she had found a source of free electricity. But what she didn't understand was that once you step into the story of someone who has spent a lifetime working with electricity, all the rules of the game change. I turned off the light, and for the first time in weeks, I was actually looking forward to the morning. Linda's scream tore through the quiet morning of the neighborhood. It was not a normal shout. It was the kind of sound that bursts out when someone suddenly realizes something completely impossible to explain. I was standing in the kitchen pouring coffee when I heard it. The mug tapped softly against the countertop. I did not need to look at the clock to know it was around 7 in the morning, the time Linda usually came out to her truck before heading to the temporary HOA office at the community center. I stepped out onto the front porch. The Rivian was still in my yard. Its nose pointed toward the shed. The orange extension cord stretched tight like a giant fishing line. Linda stood beside the truck. Her hair was not brushed yet. Her sunglasses were still missing. Her face looked tense, as if someone had suddenly pulled all the air out of her lungs. She opened the truck door, closed it, opened it again. Then she stared at the dashboard as if it had just betrayed her. I slowly walked down the porch steps. Linda spun around when she heard my footsteps. "Daniel." She said my name like an accusation. I looked at the truck. "Good morning." Linda pointed at the Rivian. "My truck." I nodded. "Yes, I see it." She swallowed, then looked back at the dashboard again as if the numbers might change if she stared long enough. It didn't charge." I tilted my head. "Really?" Linda hurried toward the shed and yanked the cable out of the outlet. She pulled so hard that the metal tip struck the wall with a dry, sharp clack. She plugged it back in. The charging light blinked. Everything looked perfectly normal. But a few seconds later, Linda looked back at the dashboard. Her face went pale. "Last night, it had 80% battery." Her voice sounded dry. "Now it's down to 20. I raised an eyebrow. "That's strange." Linda looked at me. That look. For the first time since I moved here, I saw something in her eyes other than confidence. Doubt. "What did you do?" The question came out fast and sharp like a blade. I shrugged. "Do what?" She pointed at the shed. "Your outlet. It's damaging my truck." I slowly took a sip of coffee. "Linda," I said calmly, "your truck is plugged into my electricity, on my property, without my permission." A heavy silence settled between us. The wind moved through the trees. Dry leaves rustled across the grass. Linda blinked. Then very quickly, like a switch flipping on, her expression changed. The polite social smile returned. "Daniel, don't make this dramatic." She crossed her arms. "I'm just borrowing a little electricity." "Borrowing?" I repeated. "Yes. We live in an HOA community. We help each other." She said it with the confident tone of someone who was used to her words becoming the rules. I looked at the Rivian. 20% battery. Last night, 80. A difference of 60%. Inside my head, the numbers kept moving. Linda stepped closer to me. "If there's something wrong with your outlet, you should fix it." I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing. "My outlet works perfectly. Then why is my truck losing battery?" I looked directly into her eyes. "Maybe because it shouldn't be there." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Linda tightened her jaw. I could almost see the gears turning in her head. She was trying to twist the story the way she always did during HOA meetings. But this time, there was a problem. If she complained about my outlet, she would have to admit that she had been plugging her truck into it. And Linda knew that. She took a deep breath and turned away. "I'm calling an electrician." Her voice was tight. "Maybe your system isn't stable." I nodded slightly. "You should try." Linda yanked the cable out of the outlet again, tossed it into the back of the truck, and climbed into the driver's seat. The Rivian started with a sound so quiet it was almost silent. But as she backed the truck out of my yard, I noticed something interesting. Linda did not look at me. Not once. She stared straight ahead, both hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if looking at me would force her to face a possibility she was not ready to accept. That, maybe, just maybe, the old neighbor she thought she could take advantage of was not as simple as she believed. I stood there until the truck disappeared around the corner of the street. Then I turned back and looked at the shed. The outlet was still there, quiet, waiting, and deep down I knew one thing. Linda would come back. People like her always do. 3 nights later, the Rivian came back, not sneaking, not hesitating. It slid into my yard, as if the place belonged to it. I saw the headlights sweep across the kitchen wall. The clock on the microwave flipped to 10:30 in the evening. Outside, the truck door shut, with a dry, decisive sound. Linda did not look around as much as she had the first time. She walked straight across the lawn, dragging the orange extension cord behind her. She opened my shed door and plugged the cable into the outlet. The charging light blinked green, steady and obedient. To anyone watching from the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. There was only one thing Linda did not see. The electricity was no longer flowing in the direction it used to. I stood in the darkness behind the curtain. No rush. No words. Just watching. Linda patted the hood of the truck lightly, a small gesture of satisfaction. Then she turned and walked back to her house with the relaxed posture of someone who had just solved a minor problem. She believed the previous incident had been a simple glitch, an accident, an electrical fault. Karens like Linda always believe the world will eventually adjust itself to fit them. That night, I slept very well. The next morning, the scream came again. This time louder, shorter, sharper. I stepped outside before she even had the chance to knock on my door. The Rivian sat there like an animal that had been drained of blood. The dashboard reflected the morning sunlight, displaying a number that made Linda nearly tremble. Not 20% like last time. 10. Linda turned toward me as I walked down the porch steps. You. Just one word, but it carried everything. Confusion. Suspicion. Anger. I looked at the truck. It looks like you charged it in my shed again last night. Linda gripped the strap of her bag tightly. My truck lost another 70% battery. Her voice shook, not with fear, but with the loss of control. Your outlet has a problem. I nodded slowly. Maybe. Linda stepped closer. You need to fix it. My outlet. I repeated. Yes. The outlet you keep plugging your truck into every night without asking me. Linda froze for half a second. That is always the most interesting moment in any confrontation with someone like her, when their logic runs straight into a wall. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her expression shifted. She exhaled slowly and crossed her arms, like a lawyer preparing her final argument. Daniel, you're being uncooperative. I almost laughed. Uncooperative. We live in a community. The HOA exists, so people can help each other. By taking electricity from their neighbors. Linda shook her head, her irritation growing. It's just a few kilowatts. Mine. The air between us thickened. A few windows in the neighborhood had opened. People had heard Linda shouting. In an HOA community like this, news travels faster than the wind. Linda turned to look at the truck again. 10% battery. She opened the door, sat inside, and checked the screen again, as if the number might change if she stared long enough. When she stepped out again, her eyes had changed. Not just suspicion. Frustration. What did you do to that outlet? This time the question came slower, heavier. I shrugged. What do you think I could have done? Linda stared at me. I could almost see the possibilities racing through her mind. But there was one assumption she did not want to accept. That the 62-year-old man, living alone at the end of the street, might understand electrical systems better than any electrician she could hire. Finally, Linda turned away and yanked the extension cord out of my shed. The plug snapped free and struck the door frame with a sharp metallic sound. You'll be hearing from the HOA about this. She said it over her shoulder. I'm sure I will, I replied. The Rivian backed slowly off my lawn once again, moving carefully as if the low battery made it heavier. When the truck turned the corner and disappeared down the street, I looked down at the extension cord still lying across the grass. In my mind, I could already picture Linda later that night. She would sit inside her house, staring at the truck's dashboard, calculating, frustrated, maybe calling an electrician. But there was a problem. To test the system, they would have to charge the truck at her house, not at mine. And when they did, the Rivian would work perfectly. I walked back into the shed and looked at the outlet on the wall. Inside the breaker box, the current was still quietly following the path I had designed for it. No one could see it. No one could hear it. But every night, Linda returned. Her truck would continue losing a little more energy, piece by piece, slowly, not to damage the vehicle, just to teach a lesson. A lesson every Karen eventually has to learn. Some houses in a neighborhood may look quiet, but that does not mean the people living inside them are weak. 3 days later, Linda knocked on my door like she was preparing to declare war. No greeting, no smile. Just 3 hard, decisive knocks echoing through the quiet afternoon of the neighborhood. I opened the door. Linda stood there, with her arms tightly crossed over her chest. Her sunglasses covered half her face, but I could still see the tension in her jaw. Behind her, the Rivian was parked along the curb. Not in my yard anymore. A small detail, but it said a lot. She no longer dared to park in my yard, at least not during the day. Daniel. Her voice was cold. We need to talk. I leaned against the door frame. About what? Linda removed her sunglasses. Her eyes were sharp like knives. Your outlet. I raised an eyebrow. My outlet. Yes. She took a deep breath as if trying to stay calm. My truck has lost nearly 80% of its battery over the last 2 nights. I stayed silent. Linda continued. I called an electrician. She said it like a punch. I checked the electrical system at my house. It's completely normal. Do love. She stepped closer. But every time my truck plugs into your shed, the battery drains. I crossed my arms. Then maybe you shouldn't plug your truck into my shed. Linda stared at me. A very long moment passed. Then she laughed. Not a cheerful laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had just found a way to twist the story. Daniel. She spoke slowly. I think you're sabotaging my property. The words dropped into the air like a stone. I did not answer immediately. Linda continued. You changed the electrical system. I never touched your truck. But you did something to the outlet. My outlet? I repeated. On my property. Linda crossed her arms tighter. And you know my truck is charging there. You're the one plugging it in. We live in an HOA community. She repeated the familiar mantra. We share resources. I looked at her for a long moment. Inside my head, a thought slowly formed. Linda was not just angry. She was panicking. Because there was one thing she had not said out loud. She had tried charging the truck at her own house. And the Rivian worked perfectly. Only when it was plugged into my shed did the battery drain. That was what had shaken her. Because if the problem only happened here, she could not report it to the car company. She could not call the warranty service. She could not sue the power company. She had only one option left. Blame me. You will be responsible if my truck is damaged, Linda said. Her voice was slightly louder now. I tilted my head. So you're saying your truck is being damaged because you keep plugging it into my electricity without asking? Linda froze. That sentence hit a weak spot she did not want to acknowledge. For a brief second, I saw hesitation in her eyes. Then it vanished. Karens like Linda are very good at twisting a story in seconds. You're putting the community at risk, she said. Unstable electricity can cause fires. I chuckled softly. Interesting to hear that from someone who drags an extension cord across my fence every night. Linda stepped back. You'll hear from the HOA. The words sounded almost like a threat. I'm sure I will, I replied calmly. Linda turned and walked away. But when she reached the porch steps, she stopped. Daniel. I looked at her. She turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. You think you're very smart. I said nothing. TVD. Linda stared at me for another second. Then she walked away. The Rivian door slammed shut with a dry metallic sound. The truck rolled slowly down the quiet street of the neighborhood. I stood there for a long moment. The afternoon wind moved across the grass, making the orange extension cord near the fence shift slightly. Linda had just told me I would be hearing from the HOA. Maybe she thought that would scare me. But there was one thing Linda did not know. Before I moved to Mesa Verde Estates, I spent 35 years working for the Arizona State Power Grid. Not fixing outlets. not doing residential wiring. I was the chief engineer overseeing some of the largest power distribution stations in the region. Systems where a single mistake could plunge an entire city into darkness. I looked toward the shed. The outlet on the wall sat there quietly, just like it always had. If Linda wanted to turn this into an HOA war, then she had just picked the wrong opponent. 2 days later, a power company truck pulled up in front of my house. Not a small repair van. This was a city grid inspection vehicle. 2 men in reflective jackets stepped out, carrying clipboards and measuring equipment. I looked through the living room window and let out a quiet laugh. Linda had actually done it. She had called the power company. I opened the door before they even had the chance to knock. "Good morning." One of the men looked up. "Mr. Daniel Brooks?" "That's me." The other flipped a page on his clipboard. "We received a report about unusual electricity usage at this address." I leaned lightly against the doorframe. "Unusual how?" The man glanced at the electric meter mounted on the side of my house. "Someone reported that you might be illegally pulling power from the grid." I almost laughed out loud. Linda had not just tried to blame me. She had accused me of stealing electricity. A classic move in the kind of Karen stories people tell online. But Linda had no idea who she was dealing with. "Go ahead and check," I said. The 2 men got to work. They opened the meter cover, checked the wiring, measured the current. I stood there with my arms crossed, watching. I could read every movement they made like an old book I had read many times before. The older man frowned slightly. "No signs of tampering." The other nodded. "The system looks clean." I spoke calmly. Maybe someone misunderstood something. The 2 men exchanged a glance. "We still need to check a few more things." They walked around to the back of the house. When they reached the shed, one of them opened the breaker box. He looked inside for a few seconds. Then he closed it again. "All good. Nothing unusual." Of course there wasn't, because what I had done was not damage the system. I had simply redirected the current in a very small cycle. Enough to drain energy from an electric vehicle, but not enough for standard measuring equipment to detect. The older man turned back toward me. "You work with electricity?" I shrugged. "I used to." He smiled slightly. "I figured." We shook hands. "Sorry for the trouble." They left about 15 minutes later. The truck started its engine and rolled down the street. But before it turned the corner, I noticed a figure standing behind the window of Linda's house. She was watching, waiting to see if I would be led away in handcuffs. The truck disappeared from view. I went back inside. Less than an hour later, the doorbell rang. "Linda." I opened the door. She stood there, her face tighter than the last time. "The power company just left." "Yes." "What did you tell them?" I looked at her. "Just the truth." Linda bit her lip. "You're doing something with the electricity." "I'm using my electricity." "You're damaging my truck." "Your truck is plugged into my shed." Linda stepped onto the porch, almost charging toward me. "You think you're very clever." I said nothing. She lowered her voice. "You're playing a dangerous game." I looked straight into her eyes. "Linda." She paused. "You called the power company to my house because you're doing something." "I'm using my electricity." "My truck is losing battery." "Then stop plugging it into my electricity." A heavy silence followed. The wind moved through the trees, sending dry leaves drifting across the small street of the HOA neighborhood. Linda stared at me, as if trying to find a crack in my answer. But there wasn't one, because the logic was simple. If she stopped plugging her truck into my property, nothing would happen. Finally, Linda turned away. "This isn't over," she said. "It definitely isn't," I replied. She walked quickly back toward her house, but halfway across the yard she stopped. Then she turned around. "Do you even know who I am?" I nodded. "Linda Caldwell." She shook her head. "I'm a member of the HOA board." Her voice was full of pride. "I have influence in this neighborhood." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said something Linda had never heard before. "I know." She frowned. "And I know something else." "What?" I tilted my head slightly. "The electrical system of Mesa Verde Estates." Linda stayed silent. "I designed it." For a moment. Just a moment. but I could see the change on her face. Because for the first time, Linda realized there was a possibility. This was not a Karen teaching her neighbor a lesson. This was a Karen who had just stepped into the territory of someone who understood electricity better than anyone else in the neighborhood. That evening, Linda came back. But this time, she was not carrying the extension cord. She was carrying a smile. Not a friendly smile. The kind of soft smile people wear when they want something. The doorbell rang at 8 in the evening. When I opened the door, Linda was standing there with her hands folded neatly in front of her, her hair brushed and arranged as if she were about to walk into a meeting. "Daniel." Her voice was softer than usual. "Can we talk for a moment?" I leaned against the doorframe. "You're already talking." Linda gave a small laugh and stepped onto the porch. "I think we started off the wrong way." I looked at her. 3 days ago this woman had been threatening me with the HOA. Now her voice was soft as cotton. An interesting change. "I don't want conflict with my neighbor," Linda continued. "We live in the same community." A familiar line. Karens always begin with the word community when they want something. "And I think we can help each other." I crossed my arms. "How?" Linda tilted her head slightly. "You let me use the outlet in your shed at night." I stayed silent. She continued speaking. "Just for a few hours. I'll pay for the electricity." I looked straight into her eyes. Linda didn't blink. She believed she was controlling the situation. "I don't need your money," I said. Linda smiled. "Not money." She leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice. "I could waive your HOA dues for a year." A year. Linda said it as if it were a generous gift. In Mesa Verde Estates, the annual HOA fee is around $1,800. Not small, but not life-changing either. But Linda did not have the authority to waive that fee. I knew that. She knew it too. But Linda believed I didn't. That is the interesting thing about being underestimated. People often say more than they should. "I don't think you have the authority to do that," I said calmly. Linda shrugged. "I have influence." A very Karen answer. All it takes is one word from me during the board meeting. I studied her for a moment. Inside my mind, the picture was becoming clearer. Linda had not come back to apologize. She had come back because she needed that outlet. Maybe her Rivian was not charging properly at home. Maybe the electrical system in her garage was not strong enough. Or maybe she was simply used to taking whatever she wanted from other people. And what if I say no? Linda stayed quiet for a few seconds. Her smile thinned slightly. "Daniel," she spoke slowly, "I think you should reconsider." "Why?" "Because the HOA has many ways of making life in this neighborhood uncomfortable." The night breeze moved across the porch. The palm tree in the front yard rustled softly. Linda looked straight at me, waiting for a reaction. I almost felt sorry for her. Because she still believed this was just a small power game inside a quiet neighborhood. She did not realize the game had changed long ago. "I'll think about it," I said. Linda's smile immediately returned. "See, we can cooperate." She turned and walked down the porch steps. But before leaving, she paused. "So I can plug in tonight?" I nodded. "Go ahead." Linda walked back toward her house with a noticeably lighter step. From the living room window, I watched her drive the Rivian into my yard again. The headlights swept across the grass. The orange extension cord crawled over the fence once more. She plugged it in. The charging light blinked green. I stood in the darkness and watched. But this time, I was not waiting for the truck to lose battery. I walked out to the shed, opened the breaker box, and within a few short minutes, I changed one small thing. Very small. So small that Linda would never notice. I closed the breaker box and went back inside. The Rivian still stood there, its charging light blinking steadily. Linda believed she had just won a round. But what she did not understand was that sometimes the best way to end a Karen story is to let the Karen step onto the stage herself before the curtain falls. And in just a few days, the entire HOA neighborhood would have a stage like that. The next morning, Linda stepped out of her house with a radiant smile, as if she had just won an election. Her Rivian was parked neatly in her driveway, the battery display showing nearly full. At least that was what she believed. I could see her from the kitchen window while I was making coffee. Early sunlight poured across the neighborhood of Mesa Verde Estates, making the green lawns shine as if they had been polished. A perfect morning for an HOA community. Linda opened the truck door, looked at the dashboard, and nodded with satisfaction. Last night, the electrical system in my shed had worked completely normally. No reversed current, no battery drain. I had restored it to a stable state. That was exactly what Linda needed to believe she had regained control of the situation. I took a sip of coffee and glanced at the clock. 3 days remained until the HOA Environmental Fair, the biggest event of the year in Mesa Verde Estates. Booths about solar energy, posters promoting green living, children running around with cups of organic lemonade. And this year, according to the way Linda had been bragging all over the neighborhood, her Rivian would be the highlight of the event, a symbol of sustainable living, an electric truck powered by clean energy. At least that was the story she planned to tell. The next 2 days passed in a suspiciously quiet way. Every evening, Linda drove into my yard. No more sneaking, no hesitation. She plugged in the extension cord as if it were her right. And every morning, the Rivian's battery was full. I said nothing. I did not mention the electricity bill. I did not mention the HOA. I simply watched. Linda began to relax. On the second evening, while plugging in the cable, she even waved toward my window, a fake gesture of friendliness. In her mind, the story was over. She believed she had forced the old neighbor to back down. Karens always enjoy stories like that. But the real story had only just begun. The day of the fair finally arrived. On Saturday morning, the small HOA park transformed into a festival. White tents were set up, wooden tables arranged in rows. Posters about renewable energy hung everywhere. Children ran back and forth carrying green balloons. People brought cakes, salads, and folding chairs. The atmosphere was light and friendly. But the center of everything was Linda's Rivian. She parked it right in the middle of the display area. The body of the truck was polished so carefully it reflected the sky. A sign stood in front of it. Clean energy for the future. Linda stood beside the vehicle like a presenter. Wide brim hat, white dress, perfect smile. She was explaining the benefits of electric vehicles to a group of neighbors. "We have to think about the planet," she said enthusiastically. "Vehicles like this help reduce emissions and use energy more efficiently." Some people nodded. Others simply listened politely. I stood on the other side of the park beside a small table I had registered the week before. A simple sign stood in front of it. Household electrical efficiency. A completely reasonable topic for an environmental fair. Next to the table was a small projector and a folding screen. No one found it strange. The fair was full of presentations. Linda was still talking. She placed her hand on the Rivian's hood, as if it were a trophy. "I charge my vehicle at home every night," she said loudly, "using electricity from our community." A few people clapped lightly. That was when I stepped forward. "Excuse me." My voice was not loud, but it was enough to cut through the crowd. Linda turned her head. The smile was still on her lips, but her eyes had changed. "Daniel." She said my name as if she had just found a grain of sand in a perfect dessert. "I think if we're going to talk about clean energy," I said slowly, "we should also talk about how we use it." The crowd grew quieter. Linda smiled. "Of course," she said. "What would you like to share?" I pressed a button on the projector remote. The screen lit up behind me, and on it appeared a very familiar image. A video recorded at night. A woman pulling an orange extension cord across a lawn, opening the shed door, plugging the cable into an outlet, then turning and walking away. Her face was clearly visible under the yard light. "Linda Caldwell." The smile disappeared from Linda's face. Not slowly. Instantly, the entire park fell silent. Everyone in the park fell silent. Not the polite kind of silence. It was the silence of a crowd that had just realized they were witnessing something they should not miss. On the screen, the video continued playing. Linda walked across the lawn under the yellow glow of the backyard light. The orange extension cord dragged along the ground like a snake. She opened the door to my shed, plugged the cord into the outlet, then turned back toward the Rivian parked halfway in my yard. There was no doubt. No other explanation. That was Linda, the same woman who had just stood in front of the crowd talking about clean energy and community responsibility. A ripple of murmuring spread through the crowd. I could hear the whispers clearly. That's Daniel's yard. She plugged into his power? I thought she said she charged at her own house. Linda stood completely still. The wide brim hat covered part of her face, but I could still see the red color slowly rising across her cheeks. This is fake, she said it suddenly. Her voice was higher than usual. This video has been edited. No one spoke. The video looped again. Linda pulled the cord, plugged it in, turned and walked away. Once more, and then again. A man in the crowd frowned. I remember that extension cord. He pointed at the screen. You bought it at Home Depot last summer. Linda spun toward him. It's not mine. That was a mistake. Because on the plug of the cord, when the camera zoomed in, there was a small detail. 3 letters written in marker. L.C.D. Linda Caldwell. A small laugh escaped from somewhere behind the crowd. Not loud, but enough to break the tension. Another woman shook her head. So she's been using Daniel's electricity. Someone else added. And fining the rest of us for putting our trash cans out on the wrong day. The murmuring started spreading faster. Linda turned toward me. The look in her eyes was no longer pretending to be calm. It was the look of someone who had just had the ground pulled out from under her feet. You're trying to humiliate me, she said. I did not answer. The video continued playing behind me. Another loop. Once again, Linda walked across the grass and plugged the cord into my shed. There was no explanation that could make that video disappear. The HOA president, a gray-haired man named Martin, stepped forward. He looked at the screen. Then he looked at Linda. Linda. His voice sounded tired. Is this true? Linda opened her mouth, closed it again. She looked around the crowd as if searching for an ally, but no one stepped forward, because everyone had just seen the same thing. She took a deep breath. It's just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. A man in the back repeated. A misunderstanding that involves dragging an extension cord across someone else's fence. Laughter broke out again. Not loud, but sharp. Linda clenched her hands. We are a community, she said quickly. We share resources. This time no one clapped. No one nodded. Only cold looks. Martin sighed. Linda, he said. I think the board needs to reconsider your position. It was a short sentence. But in this HOA neighborhood, it sounded like a verdict. Linda stepped back. You can't do that. We will discuss it, Martin replied, but he was no longer looking at her. The crowd began talking among themselves. Other stories began to surface. One man mentioned the fine he received because his fence was half an inch lower than the regulation height. Another talked about the warning letter he got for planting flowers in the wrong place. Small pieces of years of frustration were starting to connect. And in the middle of it all, Linda's Rivian still stood there, shining under the sunlight. A symbol of green living. A symbol of moral superiority. But now it looked like something else. Evidence. Linda looked around one last time. Her face no longer looked like the face of an HOA leader, just a woman who had lost control. She turned away. Her wide brim hat fell to the ground as she hurried through the crowd. No one picked it up. The Rivian door slammed shut. The truck rolled out of the park, leaving the environmental fair that had been her stage just minutes earlier. I stood quietly in front of the screen. The video stopped. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the conversations continued. Questions started appearing, not just about Linda, but about how the HOA had been operating for years. And as I watched the road where the Rivian had disappeared, I knew one thing. For Linda, this story was not over. People like her do not accept defeat easily. They come back. Only next time, they will bring more than just an extension cord. 3 days after the fair, I almost died in my own house. The smell woke me up close to midnight. It was not the thick smell of smoke, just the sharp scent of metal heating in a way it shouldn't, the kind of smell someone who has worked with electricity for decades can recognize instantly. I jumped out of bed. The clock on the wall showed 12:17 in the night. I moved quickly down the stairs, following the burnt smell toward the back of the house, where the shed stood silent under the moonlight. The moment I opened the door, I saw it. The breaker box was wide open. The wires inside had been pulled out and twisted together into a chaotic mess of metal. A small spark flickered and died. Another few minutes and the entire system could have caught fire. I shut off the main power immediately. The house dropped into darkness. In the heavy silence of the night, I stood in front of the electrical box and felt my heart pounding. This was no longer a petty act of revenge. This was sabotage. And there was only one person in this neighborhood with a reason to do it: Linda. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and photographed everything. The wires that had been pulled loose. The screws scattered across the floor. The shoe prints pressed into the dirt just outside the shed door. Then I called Rachel. Rachel is my lawyer, the one I contacted after Linda's harassment started escalating. She answered almost immediately. When I explained what had just happened, her voice turned cold and precise. This was no longer a neighbor dispute. This was a criminal offense. She told me to call the police. 20 minutes later, a patrol car stopped in front of my house. 2 officers stepped out, inspected the breaker box, took photos, and wrote down notes. One of them, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, looked at the twisted wires and slowly shook his head. If you hadn't found this in time, the whole place could have caught fire. I nodded. We handed over the footage from the security camera I had installed after the fair. The camera captured everything clearly. A woman entered my yard at 11:43 in the night. Long coat, hair tied back. She opened the breaker box with a screwdriver. Then she began pulling the wires loose. Her face became clear when she turned toward the light. Linda Caldwell. 2 days later, the HOA held an emergency meeting at the neighborhood clubhouse. The room was packed. Linda stood at the front, holding a thick stack of papers. When I walked in, she immediately pointed straight at me. This man is a danger to the community. Her voice echoed across the room. She claimed my shed violated regulations. She said my electrical system was unsafe. She accused me of trying to destroy her reputation. She talked fast and endlessly, as if saying enough words might make the truth disappear. I waited until she finished. Then I stood up. I said only one sentence. Let's watch this video. I plugged the USB drive into the projector. The screen lit up. The entire room fell silent. The video began to play. Linda in my yard. Linda opening the breaker box. Linda twisting the wires. There was no room for explanation. The HOA president stood up. Linda. His voice was heavy. You are suspended immediately. But the story did not end with the HOA. The police had enough evidence. 3 days later, a patrol car stopped in front of Linda's house. I watched as the officers walked up to her porch. The door opened. A short conversation followed. Then they led her out in handcuffs. Some neighbors watched from behind their windows. Others stood quietly in their yards. No one said a word. After Linda was gone, the neighborhood changed quickly. HOA meetings became quieter. The ridiculous rules began to disappear. People started talking to each other instead of sending violation letters. My shed still stands where it always did. I replaced the entire electrical system, installed a new lock, and checked every outlet carefully. Sometimes in the evening I stand by the window and look out at the patch of grass where the Rivian once parked. No more orange extension cord. No more quiet footsteps sneaking through the yard at night. Just silence. People say Linda sold her house for a low price and moved somewhere else. Maybe in another neighborhood she is still telling the story in her own version. Maybe she still believes she was the victim. But in Mesa Verde Estates, everyone remembers what really happened. An electric vehicle, an extension cord pulled across a fence, and a Karen who believed no one would dare stand up. If you have ever lived in an HOA community, you know that kind of person. And I am curious about one thing. Have you ever met a Karen like that? If you have, tell your story. I read every one of them. And if you want to hear more stories like this, follow the channel. Because sometimes, the most ordinary neighbor stories become the ones people remember the longest.